Have you ever stopped to wonder why the maps in your Bible look so different from the actual geography of the ancient world? What if I told you that the greatest revelations about the chosen people weren't found in European libraries, but are engraved in the DNA and soil of the African continent? Could the story we've been told have been deliberately designed to hide the fact that the patriarchs, prophets, and the Messiah himself carried the color and wisdom of the lands of Kush? Today, we will unlock a secret kept for millennia, the hidden connection between the Bible and Africa that official history has tried to erase. Prepare for a journey that goes beyond textbooks, delving into archaeological discoveries, linguistic analyses, and spiritual mysteries that prove the cradle of humanity is also the cradle of faith. What you are about to hear may forever change how you see yourself and the sacred world. If you seek the truth that the shadows have tried to hide, you're in the right place. Before we reveal the first secret, make sure you're already part of our brotherhood of truth seekers by subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. Leave a like so this revelation reaches more souls, and comment below. From which part of this vast world are you hearing this ancient story today? Your presence is what keeps this flame burning. In the beginning, when the divine breath still hovered over the waters, the earth knew no borders drawn by men with paper maps. What we now call the Middle East was, in fact, a continuous extension of the tectonic plate that supports the African soil, an uninterrupted land bridge. Ancient scriptures did not speak of isolated continents, but of a world where the sacred walked upon the red and fertile clay of the Great Rift Valley. Imagine the Creator molding man from the dust of the earth, a dust that carried the intense heat and iron from the depths of Africa. Biblical geography begins in the Great Valley, where the earth tears open to reveal its depths, connecting the headwaters of the Nile to the deserts that would one day be called the homeland of the prophets. There was no physical separation, only a vast empire of life that pulsed under a sovereign and relentless sun. The lineages mentioned in the oldest texts, engraved on rock and parchment, follow the course of waters flowing from south to north, nourishing civilizations even before writing existed. When Genesis speaks of names and origins, it points to a quadrant of the world that modernity has desperately tried to separate from the rest of the African body for political convenience. But the stones do not lie, and they whisper of a territorial unity that time and prejudice have tried to erase. In this landscape of red earth and endless skies, humanity's first footprints were left, carrying with them the promise of an alliance that would span millennia. The patriarchs walked through pastures that are now deserts, but which were once the backyard of kingdoms that official history prefers to keep in oblivion. Each step taken on this soil was an act of connection with a force that came from the depths of the continent, shaping the destiny of entire nations. Looking at ancient maps, we realize that the Holy Land is merely the tip of a geological and cultural iceberg deeply rooted in African mysticism. The mystery of origin lies not in an isolated point on the modern map, but in a network of river veins connecting the heart of Africa to the spiritual destiny of humanity. It is in this soil, rich in secrets and memory, that we discover that the first promise may have been whispered under the shade of trees that only grow in one place, guarding the secret of who the people the scriptures call mine truly were. Long ago, before borders were drawn on yellowed paper, the land knew no divisions between what we call the East and the heart of Africa. The soil was a single piece of a colossal puzzle, where the African tectonic plate stretched its arms across the valley that today holds the stories of the prophets. There was no sea or wall separating the red clay of Egypt from the sands of Canaan, creating a continuous corridor of life and spirituality. Imagine the Creator leaning over this immense garden, shaping humanity from the dust of soil rich in iron and heat, the same heat that pulses in the veins of the mother continent. The dust of the earth mentioned in sacred texts was not pale or cold, but carried the vibrant hue of the Ethiopian highlands and the Great Rift Valley. It was a direct connection between the flesh of man and the soul of the African land, a link that modern history has tried, at all costs, to camouflage. The oldest writings whisper of rivers that did not follow today's maps, but that were born and flowed through a territory that did not know the word continent. The patriarchs walked through pastures that were natural extensions of the savannas, guiding their herds under the same sovereign sun that gilded the pyramids and mountains of Kush. For those ancient wanderers, the Holy Land was not an isolated enclave, but the extension of a much larger and deeper cradle. Throughout the millennia, strange voices have emerged to reshape the world, attempting to separate what nature and spirit had united for ages. They erected imaginary geographical barriers, as if they could cut the root that nourishes the tree, forgetting that the stones hold the memory of unity. What the world today calls the Middle East is nothing more than Northeast Africa, a piece of land that breathes the same air and drinks from the same ancestral source. But the mystery of this physical union is only the beginning of a revelation that shakes the foundations of what we were taught in schools. If the ground beneath the prophets' feet was the same African soil, what does that tell us about the blood that ran in their veins and the color of their skin? The footprints left in the dust of this land bridge lead to a place where water is life, and 4 specific rivers hold the secret to the exact location where the first human breath was taken. In the beginning, the scriptures describe a garden watered by 4 majestic rivers that served as the veins of the newly created world. 2 of these rivers, the Pishon and the Gihon, are described as circling lands rich in gold and precious stones, lands that ancient tradition has always identified as the heart of Ethiopia and Sudan. The aroma of incense and the fertility of these waters leave no room for doubt as to where Eden planted its deepest roots. It was a land where the sky and the earth met, nourished by floods that brought life from the highest mountains to the sacred valleys. The sacred text points to a geography of abundance that only the interior of the African continent possessed, with rivers that meandered through realms full of spiritual mysteries. There, the first man and the first woman felt the warmth of the earth that pulsed with divine energy, long before any modern map was drawn. Many try to locate this paradise in arid deserts, but the clues left by the ancients point to the river basins that feed the Great Nile. The Gihon, mentioned as the one that encircles the entire land of Kush, carries in its name the force of a current that knows no human boundaries. It is a symbolic journey that takes us back to the cradle, where nature was the first temple and each fruit-bearing tree was a direct gift from the Creator. The wisdom contained in these accounts suggests that humanity was not born in a vacuum, but in a vibrant African ecosystem full of hidden meaning. The connection between the life-giving water and the land of Kush reveals a profound intimacy between divinity and the continent's black, fertile soil. It was there that the secret of immortality was kept, protected by guardians who understood that spirit and matter are made of the same earthy substance. As we follow the course of these ancient rivers, we realize that the location of Eden is key to understanding the true identity of those who walked its paths. If the garden was in the heart of the continent, the first inhabitants of Earth carried in their appearance and spirit the essence of that geography. But this sacred lineage did not stop in paradise. It expanded and gave rise to a powerful nation, whose name would echo throughout the pages of biblical history. Ancient history lavishes praise on Kush, the kingdom that shone like gold under the blazing sun of southern Egypt. In scripture, being a Kushite meant being a tall warrior with radiant skin, respected by kings and feared by armies across the earth. This people was not merely a distant neighbor, but the true pillar upon which the spirituality and strength of the civilizations that shaped the ancient world were built. Imagine cities of pointed pyramids and temples carved into the rock, where the sound of sacred drums mingled with prayers rising to the Creator. Kush was the cradle of a nobility that saw no separation between political power and connection to the divine, governing with a wisdom passed down through generations of stargazers. For the ancient prophets, to speak of Kush was to speak of a land of unquestionable dignity, where the chosen people found refuge and respect. The identity of these people was etched in their posture and unwavering faith, defying the idea that divine wisdom was exclusive to a single small territory. They were the guardians of the southern routes, the lords of iron and gold, who treated the divine with an intimacy that few dared to have. Each ritual performed on the banks of the Upper Nile was an echo of an older truth, connecting heaven directly to the black, pulsating heart of Africa. Often, official history attempts to reduce this kingdom to a mere footnote, but the Bible places it center stage at crucial moments. Kushite kings marched to protect Jerusalem, and Kushite sages were consulted when the mysteries of the spirit seemed too difficult to decipher. There was a silent reverence in the air whenever a messenger from this land crossed the borders, for all knew they carried secrets that time could not erase. This lineage of power and mystery was not merely a matter of geography, but of blood that carried a profound spiritual promise. When we look at the heroes of Kush, we begin to see faces that European art has tried to fade, but which the sacred text insists on keeping vivid. And when one of these great leaders, Moses himself, chose to unite his destiny with a woman of this people, he was not merely marrying. He was sealing a connection that would shake the foundations of his own family. In the silence of the Sinai desert, one of the greatest leaders humanity has ever known made a decision that caused a true earthquake among his people. Moses, the man who spoke with the divine face to face, did not seek his companion among the tribes of Israel, but rather in the heart of the Kushite lineage. By uniting with Zipporah, a woman of dark skin and ancestral wisdom, he was intertwining the destiny of a people's liberation with the sacred blood of Africa. This union was not merely a gesture of love, but an act that carried a profound spiritual symbolism and, for some, a forbidden one. When his own siblings, Miriam and Aaron, began to murmur against him because of his Kushite wife, the response from heaven was immediate and severe, as if the Creator were defending the dignity of that lineage. It was not just a foreign marriage, but the recognition that the wisdom Moses possessed had roots that drank from the same African source. Imagine the scene: the great prophet, educated in the mysteries of Kemet and now married to the daughter of a desert priest, listening to advice on how to govern his people. Zipporah was not a shadow, but a force that intervened in moments of life or death, saving Moses with rituals she knew by heritage. She carried with her the knowledge of herbs, cycles, and divine protection, elements that were natural to someone who came from the lands of Kush. History often tries to portray this episode as an unimportant detail, but the weight of an African woman alongside the Israelite lawgiver changes everything we know about the purity of lineages. If the mother of Moses' children was Kushite, then the blood that inherited leadership and the promise was mixed with the vibrant essence of the South. It was an alliance of power and spirit that united the prophet's staff with the ancient wisdom of the African savannas and mountains. This forbidden connection between the prophet and the woman of Kush opens a door to an even greater mystery, guarded in the shadows of the stone pillars. If Moses found his strength and support in an African lineage, what about the land where he was raised and the secrets he learned in the temples of Egypt? The glint of gold and the mystery of the dark skin of the pharaohs begin to reveal that the Exodus was, in fact, a movement within the same large family of dark origins. For centuries, the world has been taught to view ancient Egypt, the land of Kemet, as something isolated from the rest of the continent, as if the pyramids had fallen from the sky. But the truth, etched into the limestone walls and the DNA of royal bones, tells a very different story of a people who called themselves the Blacks. Kemet was not a foreign oasis, but the crown jewel of a civilization that flourished from south to north, following the sacred course of the Nile. The pharaohs who ruled the destiny of the ancient world were not pale marble figures, but men and women whose skin carried the depth of the night and the heat of the African soil. Their rituals, their crowns, and even the way they worshipped the sun had direct parallels with the kingdoms that pulsed in the heart of Central Africa. By erasing the color of Kemet, official history attempted to wrest Africa from its throne of wisdom, but the sphinxes still bear the traces of those who erected them. Walking through the temples of Luxor is like leafing through a family album that has been deliberately hidden in the shadows of European libraries. Each hieroglyph whispers of an unbreakable connection between Egyptian science and the spirituality of the great forests and savannas. They were masters of mathematics, astronomy, and resurrection, knowledge that did not spring from a vacuum, but was distilled through millennia of observation of African nature and its divine laws. The conflict here is not merely about pigmentation, but about who has the right to be the father of civilization and faith. When the scriptures speak of Egypt as the place where the patriarchs sought bread and shelter, they are describing a return to the cradle, a reunion with more prosperous relatives. Egypt was living proof that the African mind had deciphered the codes of the universe long before the rest of the world awakened to the light of reason. This truth about Kemet serves as a mirror reflecting an image that many still fear to confront. If the great sages and kings of Egypt were African in essence and appearance, the entire narrative about the inferiority of a people crumbles like a house of cards. And it is in this scenario of wealth and power that an even more mysterious connection emerges, involving hidden gold mines and a king whose wisdom crossed the seas in search of treasures in distant lands. Deep within royal chronicles, echoes the name of a place shrouded in mist and wealth, Ophir, the land that supplied the purest gold for King Solomon's temple. While many seek this kingdom on distant maps, the traces of ancient ships and trade routes point south, where great Zimbabwe erected its stone walls without the use of mortar. There, in the heart of southern Africa, the gleam of the precious metal was not merely wealth, but a reflection of the divine light that adorned the sacred. Imagine Solomon's fleets sailing for months, guided by the stars and the warm currents of the Indian Ocean, to reach ports where gold was exchanged for wisdom and alliances. This commercial connection was, in fact, a spiritual umbilical cord linking Jerusalem to the ancestral mines that the local peoples guarded with rituals and reverence. The gold that covered the Ark of the Covenant and the walls of the Holy of Holies had the scent of African earth and the energy of a soil that the ancients considered blessed. Great Zimbabwe, with its conical towers and monumental enclosures, remains a silent testament to engineering that defied time and simplistic explanations. Those walls were not merely fortresses, but centers of a network that distributed not only minerals, but a worldview where the king was the link between heaven and earth. The sophistication of this empire was such that travelers of yesteryear could not believe that human hands, so close to nature, could have erected such a marvel. There was a deliberate effort to portray these constructions as the work of foreigners, for the idea of an African civilization financing the glory of Israel was a difficult secret to accept. But the soil does not lie, and the glass beads, wrought iron, and refined gold found in the ruins tell the story of a people who were the central bank of antiquity. Solomon, in all his glory, depended on the mastery and generosity of this land that the modern world insists on calling wild. This golden bridge between the wise king and the southern mines reveals an intimacy that went far beyond trade, suggesting a brotherhood of lineages and hidden knowledge. And if gold traveled from Africa to Jerusalem, something even more sacred would make the reverse journey, seeking final refuge in the sacred mountains of the continent. The fate of the Ark of the Covenant, the most powerful object in the scriptures, is linked to an encounter that would forever change the face of faith in Ethiopia. In the sacred mountains of Ethiopia, the air is thin and carries the weight of a secret that the Western world has tried to transform into legend, the real presence of the Ark of the Covenant. In Aksum, guarded by monks who dedicate their entire lives to protecting this mystery, resides the object that contained the tablets of the law and the very presence of the divine. It is not a replica or a symbol, but a legacy of blood and spirit that crossed deserts to find its true home on African soil. Ancient traditions say that this encounter was sealed when the Queen of Sheba, a sovereign of unparalleled intellect and beauty, traveled to Jerusalem to test Solomon's wisdom. From this union between African intelligence and the lineage of Israel, Menelik I, the first emperor of Ethiopia, was born, who is said to have brought the sacred artifact to the lands of his people. The Ark's journey was not an escape, but a planned return to the continent where faith is lived with an intensity that words can hardly describe. Imagine the solemn procession crossing the borders of Kush, with Levites and warriors protecting God's glory under the scorching sun. while the clouds parted in a sign of divine approval. In Ethiopia, the Ark is not a museum piece, but the beating heart of the identity of a nation that was never colonized, keeping its spiritual lineage intact for millennia. Each rock-carved church in Lalibela seems to be an echo of this sacred presence, a human endeavor to draw closer to what is highest in heaven. The mystery guarded in Aksum is so powerful that only a guardian, chosen by divine signs, is permitted to enter the sanctuary, dying without ever seeing the light of the outside world again. This isolation is not out of fear, but out of an ancestral respect for an energy that modern science cannot measure or explain. The world asks, "Where is the Ark?" while the Ethiopian people simply smile, knowing that the answer is engraved in the very earth that sustains them. This age-old protection reveals that Africa was not only the setting for biblical stories, but also the safe haven for humanity's deepest secrets. If the most sacred object in the Bible chose African soil as its refuge, what else might be hidden in the details of the tabernacle's construction? The materials used to house the divine presence, from ritual skins to precious woods, begin to tell a story that heaven, in fact, had a very specific scent of African earth. When the divine gave instructions for the construction of the tabernacle in the desert, he did not ask for common materials or those easily found on any corner of the world. He demanded animal skins that roamed freely across the African savannas and rare woods that withstood time and termites, as if the temple itself were a piece of Africa in motion. Every detail of that sacred tent was a living symbol, a tactile connection to the wild and powerful nature that pulsates in the south of the great continent. The vibrant colors of the curtains, dyed with secrets that the artisans of Kemet and Kush kept under lock and key, transformed the holy place into an explosion of sensory life. The scent of incense, mixed with the aroma of exotic animal hides and acacia wood, created an atmosphere that transported anyone directly to the sacred forests. It was not just a place of prayer. It was an environment that breathed the essence of a land where spirituality and nature were never separated by walls. Imagine the priests handling objects that carried the energy of distant lands, feeling under their fingers the texture of materials that spoke of an ancestral and indomitable power. These hidden symbols in the tabernacle were like codes that only those who knew the soul of Africa could fully decipher, uniting the sacred with what is most raw and pure in the soil. It was as if, to find God, the people had to surround themselves with elements that constantly reminded them of the cradle from which all life sprang. This divine choice of African materials reveals that true worship requires a connection to the origin, to the raw materials that the Creator generously spread across the mother continent. Nothing in the tabernacle was by chance. Each fiber and each piece of leather were silent reminders that God's glory manifested itself through the beauty and strength of African flora and fauna. That nomadic structure was, in essence, an African sanctuary that guided the steps of a nation in search of its destiny. These clues hidden in rituals and sacred constructions are like golden threads that lead us to even deeper and more direct prophecies. If the temple itself bore the mark of Africa, it is no wonder that the voices of the prophets echoed promises about peoples who would come from places that history has tried to erase. One of these voices, that of Zephaniah, left a recorded revelation about worshippers who would cross unimaginable borders to bring their offerings to the one and true King. There was a time when the words of the prophets were not merely promises, but spiritual maps pointing south, far beyond what ordinary eyes could see. Zephaniah, a man whose voice carried the weight of truth, left behind a mystery that defies centuries of limited interpretations. He spoke of worshippers who would bring offerings from beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. This phrase was not a geographical guess, but a revelation about where the true flame of faith would remain burning when the world grew cold. Imagine the impact of those words echoing through the hills of Jerusalem, suggesting that the heart of worship would not be in stone temples, but in the peoples who inhabited the depths of the African continent. Beyond the rivers, where the waters of the Nile and the Niger shaped the destiny of nations, there existed a people whom the Creator called mine. It was a prophecy that recognized Africa not as a land of converts, but as the original guardian of a devotion that time could not corrupt. The rivers of Ethiopia, mentioned, were the frontier of the known, the boundary where conventional wisdom ended and sacred mystery began to flourish. Those who would come from there were not foreigners seeking a new god, but children returning with the fruits of a land that had always known how to honor the invisible through rhythm and spirit. Each step taken by these worshippers, crossing deserts and savannas, was the fulfillment of a plan drawn up even before the foundation of the lineages we know today. This prophetic vision creates an unbreakable link between the divine promise and the identity of the peoples who inhabit the heart and south of Africa, elevating their dignity to the highest level of the sacred. Zephaniah did not see a forgotten land, but a reservoir of spiritual purity that would be revealed at the right time to challenge the pride of nations. The prophecy acted as a beacon, illuminating faces that history would try to hide under the veil of forgetfulness and cultural distortion. As we delve into the mystery of Zephaniah, we realize that Africa has always been the ultimate destination of the glory that the world has often scorned. But this spiritual strength was not sustained solely by male warriors or prophets. There was a female presence, hidden in the folds of the desert, that ensured the lineage of faith would never be lost. Zipporah, the Kushite, was not only the wife of a leader, but the bearer of a practical and mystical knowledge that would save the very life of Israel's liberator. In the silence of the sands, where the wind whispers ancient secrets, the figure of Zipporah emerges not only as a companion, but as the guardian of a knowledge the world has forgotten. She did not come from a land of silence, but from a desert that pulsed with the wisdom of herbs, stars, and protective rituals mastered only by the daughters of Cush. When death hovered around Moses' tent on a dark night, it was the hand of this African woman that wielded the sacred instrument to seal the covenant and ward off destruction. Zipporah's gestures carried the authority of a lineage of priests who understood the invisible laws governing life and death. She didn't need grand temples to connect with the Creator, for she carried the altar within herself, nourished by the strength of an ancestry that never bowed before human fears. Her intervention was an act of spiritual mastery, proof that the wisdom guiding the first steps toward a people's liberation drank directly from the mystical African source. Imagine the strength of this woman, walking with dignity among those who looked at her with strangeness, remaining the invisible pillar that supported the greatest prophet in history. She was the balance between written law and pulsating life, bringing the practicality of the desert into discussions about the destiny of nations. In each purification ritual and in each piece of advice whispered in the ear, Zipporah whispered the voice of a continent that always knew that the sacred lies in the details of existence. History often attempts to silence the impact of these women, reducing them to decorative figures or voiceless foreigners, but ancient texts leave clues to their vital importance. If Moses was the arm that liberated, Zipporah was the spirit that protected, ensuring that the fire of the promise did not go out in the face of the challenges of the journey. She was the living link between the revelation at Sinai and the spiritual depth that already existed in the lands of her fathers, long before any commandment was engraved in stone. This powerful feminine presence paves the way for a much deeper understanding of the very image of the divine and of those he chose to represent him. If Zipporah's African wisdom was essential to the success of Moses' mission, what does this tell us about the appearance and essence of the Messiah that the prophecies promised? The mystery deepens when we look at descriptions that compare the sacred to metal molten in fire and wool growing under the intense sun. Ancient prophecies, when read with eyes free from veils, offer descriptions that shock those accustomed to pale images in European stained glass. When the prophet Daniel and the apostle John had visions of the Messiah and the Eternal One himself, they did not speak of fine features or hair flowing like silk. They described someone whose feet shone like bronze polished in a furnace and whose hair possessed the dense, sacred texture of sheep's wool. This image is not merely a poetic metaphor, but a visual description that any child born under the African sun would recognize in the mirror of their own home. The molten bronze carries the depth of the dark earth, the strength of a metal forged in fire to become indestructible and sovereign. To have hair like wool is to possess the natural crown that grows towards the sky, a unique characteristic of those whose roots are firmly planted in the soil of the mother continent. Imagine the power of this revelation, the Messiah, the bridge between the human and the divine, being described with the exact physical characteristics of the peoples who inhabit the banks of the Nile and the southern savannas. This is not an aesthetic coincidence, but a message of identity that the modern world has tried to erase for fear of the power this image carries. The bronze Christ is an affirmation that divinity chose the aesthetics of resistance and depth to manifest itself on earth. By reclaiming this sensory image, the scriptures cease to be a distant book and become a family album for millions of people who have been taught to see themselves as strangers to the sacred. Radiant skin and curly hair cease to be marks of exclusion and become attributes of divine glory itself in its purest form. It is a journey back home, where the sacred has the face of the one who has always been the guardian of life and the most ancient spirituality on the planet. But this physical appearance was only the outward sign of a much deeper connection that linked the scattered tribes to the spiritual destiny of humanity. If the image of the Messiah reflected the people of Africa, what happened to the great nations that migrated and carried this sacred essence with them? The trail of this lineage does not end in ancient texts, but follows the course of a great dispersal that spread the secret of the chosen people to every corner of the continent and beyond. There was a time when the desert sands were not merely dust, but the record of an endless journey that carried the secret of sacred blood to the heart of the jungle. When the great civilizations of the north began to tremble under the weight of foreign empires, a vast wave of people began to move south and west, carrying with them more than just possessions. This great dispersion, known to many as the Bantu migration, holds within its depths the history of a people who carried the divine covenant in their customs and in their DNA. Imagine thousands of families crossing mighty rivers and dense forests, keeping alive rituals that seem to be direct echoes of the laws of Moses and the ancient prophets. They were not simply nomads in search of pasture, but bearers of a spiritual heritage that needed to be protected from oblivion and persecution. Wherever they went, they established laws of purity, rites of passage, and a connection with the Creator that mirrored, almost identically, the traditions described in the oldest scrolls of the faith. The marks of this journey are scattered throughout the continent, from the way tribes recounted their lineages to the sacred respect for rest and family. It was as if an entire nation was being hidden in the depths of Africa, far from the eyes of those who wanted to erase its identity and its brilliance. This silent movement transformed the continent's map into a living sanctuary, where the promise of a chosen people continued to pulsate beneath the canopy of giant trees. Many historians view these migrations merely as economic movements, but those who listen to the sound of the drums and the stories of the elders know that something much deeper was at play. They carried the technology of iron and the wisdom of the spirit, building kingdoms that mirrored an ancient glory the world thought had vanished. With each new village founded, the flame of that original identity was kept burning, protected by languages that held secrets the invader could never translate. This network of dispersed peoples created a web of cultural resistance that continues to defy attempts at spiritual colonization of the continent. But while many journeyed south, others remained in the isolated mountains, guarding manuscripts that the Western world would only come to know much later. In the stone libraries and suspended monasteries of Ethiopia, sacred texts written in an ancient language revealed truths that were deliberately left out of official canons. Deep within the Amhara Mountains, where clouds seem to rest upon granite peaks, time does not flow as it does in the rest of the world. There, in monasteries that defy gravity, monks with calloused hands protect scrolls made of goatskin, written in the ancient Gizi language. While the West decided which books the world should read, Ethiopia silently guarded texts like the Book of Enoch, which reveal celestial secrets swept from the altars of other nations. These manuscripts are not merely paper and ink, but time capsules preserving the vision of a world where the spiritual and the physical walked hand in hand without secrets. The Gizi language, with its characters that seem to dance on leather, is the only one capable of conveying certain truths that are lost in any modern translation. It is as if Africa was chosen to be humanity's safe, keeping locked away the keys to mysteries that modern man is not yet ready to understand. Imagine the shock of the explorers when they discovered that the texts they considered lost or forbidden were read daily by children and elders in African villages. There, stories about ancient giants, the secrets of the stars, and the hierarchy of angels were never treated as myths, but as part of the very genealogy of the land. This living library of stone and faith shows that the continent was never a place of emptiness, but of a literary and sacred abundance that predates the empires of Europe. The geographical isolation of these mountains served as a divine shield against the bonfires of the Inquisition and the greed of the destroyers of culture. Each page turned in the dim light of Lalabella's churches is an act of resistance against the erasure of an identity that is simultaneously African and universal. The wisdom contained in these excluded books challenges the logic that spiritual truth could only come from a single center of power, revealing that the heights of the Ethiopian mountains are much closer to heaven. These literary revelations are just the tip of the iceberg of a story of resistance that survived not only in books, but in the very blood of communities that refused to forget who they were. While the manuscripts preserved the theory, in the Simeon Mountains, a group of warriors and shepherds lived the practice of a faith that the world believed had been extinct centuries before. The Falashes, the Black Jews, kept alive a flame that neither isolation nor time could extinguish. On the steep, icy slopes of the Simeon Mountains, far from trade routes and the prying eyes of the empire, a people with profound gazes kept alive a flame that the world thought extinguished. They were known as the Falashes, the strangers in their own land, but in their hearts they were the Beta Israel, the house of Israel. While the rest of the planet changed gods and kings, these Black Jews preserved rituals of purity and sacrifices that seemed to have come straight from the pages of Exodus, untouched by the reforms of time. Their existence was a living challenge to theories that attempted to whitewash the lineage of the prophets and isolate the Abrahamic faith in a single corner of the map. They were unfamiliar with the Talmud or European traditions, for their connection predated all of that. They drank directly from the ancient priests who crossed the Nile millennia ago. For the Falashes, the Torah was not merely a book, but a code of life that pulsed in their harvests, in their white garments, and in the way they observed sacred rest under the African sun. Imagine the strength required to maintain this identity for generations, surrounded by external pressures and the silence of a world that refused to believe their story. They saw themselves as guardians of a promise that did not depend on stone temples, but on obedience to the unseen and the preservation of sacred blood. Each song sung in their mud and straw villages was an echo of Jerusalem, proof that the divine covenant had found a safe haven among the rocks and gorges of Africa. Some have tried to claim they were late converts, but the genetics and depth of their ancient customs told a story of millennia of continuity. They were proof that the chosen people were never a matter of limited geography, but of a spiritual dispersion that chose the resilience of the African mountains to survive. Even in the face of persecution and global oblivion, the Falashes remained sentinels of a truth that the modern world is only now beginning to rediscover with astonishment. This silent resistance of Black Jews is just one thread in a much larger tapestry that encompasses the very language we speak and the names we bear. If we look closely at the sacred words and names of the patriarchs, we will discover that many of them were not born in distant libraries, but have roots that flourish in still-living African dialects. The mystery of the names reveals that communication with the divine may have begun in a language that still echoes in the savannas and forests of the continent. The words we use to call upon the sacred and name our ancestors carry a secret that translators have often missed. If you listen carefully to the ancient dialects that still echo from the villages of Nigeria to the mountains of South Africa, you will find sonorous roots that christen the heroes of Scripture. Names that the Western world reads as strange possess vivid and profound meanings in African languages, revealing that communication between man and the divine may have been born in a much more familiar soil than we have been told. Imagine the surprise of discovering that the names of biblical patriarchs and cities are not merely random sounds, but precise descriptions of characteristics and events that only make sense in the language of those who inhabit the land. It's as if a code has been left behind, a linguistic signature that proves who the true authors and protagonists of those stories were. When an elder in an African village pronounces a sacred name, he is not merely quoting a book, he is invoking an ancestor whose name describes his own soul and destiny. This linguistic connection acts as an invisible bridge spanning centuries, uniting the grammar of the spirit with the vocabulary of the mother continent. Many terms used to describe the creator, sacrifice, and law have such exact parallels in languages like Yoruba, Igbo, or Bantu that the coincidence becomes impossible to sustain. It is a symbolic journey that shows us that the Bible was not merely translated for the world. It was, to a large extent, inspired by a worldview that already spoke the language of Africa. There has been a colossal effort to disconnect these names from their origin, changing phonemes and softening tones to make them seem to belong to other lands. But the melody of African speech is persistent and resists any attempt at silencing, keeping alive the proof that a people's identity is preserved in the way they name life. Every time an ancient name is pronounced correctly, a veil is torn, revealing that sacred history is much closer to us than the shadows of libraries suggest. This conflict of names and meanings is the final piece of a puzzle that exposes the greatest of all wounds, the deliberate persecution of ancestral knowledge. If names reveal origin, why was there so much effort to change them and hide their source? What would the world gain by erasing the identity of a people who gave their name to the sacred itself? The mystery becomes a question of power, where the distortion of history served as the sharpest weapon for the control of entire nations. There was a time when truth was not only forgotten, but deliberately buried under layers of paper and enforced silence. When the great powers decided to divide the world, they understood that to enslave the body, it was first necessary to erase the memory of the soul and the glory of the past. Thus, kings were transformed into servants in history books, and the gods and heroes of Africa were painted with colors that did not belong to them, creating a chasm between the people and their own sacred greatness. The shelves of colonial libraries were filled with a narrative that cast the continent into the shadows of ignorance, while its artifacts and knowledge were stolen to decorate foreign palaces. This persecution of knowledge was a silent war, where the goal was to make the descendants of kings see themselves as rootless, unwritten, and without God. The Bible had to appear as a book for strangers, not as a record of a heritage that had always flowed in the veins of those now enslaved. Imagine the pain of having your identity distorted to justify oppression, transforming the radiant skin, once a sign of divinity, into a pretext for contempt. Millennia-old rituals were labeled witchcraft, and the wisdom of the elders was treated as superstition by those who feared the power of a people conscious of their origin. This distortion was not a translation error, but a control strategy aimed at severing the golden thread that linked the African heart to the throne of the Creator. But despite all the efforts to burn the records and silence the drums, the truth has its own way of surviving in the cracks of time. It remained alive in lullabies, in symbols hidden in fabrics, and in the structure of families that refused to crumble before the lash. African knowledge became a whispered secret, a spiritual resistance that awaited the right moment to be unearthed and shine again under the light of historical justice. Today, the shadows are beginning to recede as new voices and attentive eyes begin to question every comma of official history. What was once considered a continent without history is now revealed as the epicenter of an archaeology of silence, where each excavation brings to light evidence that challenges the chronology of the modern world. In the sands of Northeast Africa, stones that have been ignored for centuries are beginning to shout truths that change everything we thought we knew about the beginning of time. On the scorching sands of Sudan and Egypt, where the wind blows the dust of forgotten empires, a new story is being written with the aid of shovels and brushes. The archaeology of silence has begun to reveal that monumental cities and temples dedicated to the Creator existed in the heart of Africa long before European books dared to admit. These are stones that speak, walls that guard secrets of precise astronomy, and a writing system that owes nothing to the power centers of the ancient world. Imagine archaeologists discovering that the trade routes and prayer centers of ancient Israel were intimately linked to urban complexes in the heart of the African continent. Recent discoveries show that the sophistication of Kush and Kemet was not an exception, but the rule in a network of wisdom that stretched for thousands of kilometers. Each artifact unearthed is like a piece of a puzzle proving that the Bible described a vibrant, technological African world deeply connected to the sacred. There has been an effort to claim that Africa's great constructions were the result of external influences, but the layers of soil reveal a pure and powerful native evolution. The pyramids of Meroe and the ruins of lost kingdoms in the desert show that the African mind had already deciphered the codes of eternity when the rest of the world was still in its infancy. It is a journey of discovery that forces us to look back and recognize that the silence of official history was, in fact, an attempt to stifle the cry of greatness of a people. With each new archaeological site revealed, the narrative that knowledge originated in other seas crumbles before the evidence of facts engraved in granite. Temples dedicated to deities who protect justice and truth emerge from the earth, showing that the morality and faith we follow today have roots in black and fertile soil. This is not a new history, but the rescue of real history, which remained protected by the earth itself until we were ready to hear it again. This awakening of the stones now unites with a modern science that looks not at the soil, but within us, at the invisible helices we carry in every cell. If the ruins prove where they lived, the blood proves who they were and where they went after the great dispersals. The mystery that archaeology began to unearth finds its final confirmation in DNA, revealing genetic connections that link West African tribes directly to the most sacred lineages of antiquity. What the stones began to whisper, the blood now confirms in a silent cry that echoes within our own cells. Modern science, armed with genetic maps, has delved into the DNA of tribes inhabiting West and Southern Africa and found something that has shocked the academic world. Specific markers, which identify the oldest priestly lineages mentioned in Scripture, shine brightly in the genetic code of peoples many considered distant from sacred history. Imagine the impact of discovering that the priestly gene, passed down through generations since the time of Aaron, pulsates today in the veins of communities that have kept their traditions secret for millennia. This is not a statistical coincidence, but biological proof that the promise of a holy lineage was never lost. It simply hid where no one would think to look. It is as if the Creator signed his work in the safest place of all, within man, where no army or bonfire could reach. This genetic heritage directly links peoples like the Lemba and certain lineages of West Africa to the events that shaped the spiritual destiny of humanity. Men and women who walk the streets of Lagos or the mountains of Zimbabwe today carry within them the same biological signature of the kings and prophets who walked with the divine at the beginning of time. Science is only now catching up to what ancestral memory and the stories told by elders affirmed by the light of campfires long before laboratories existed. The revelation that sacred blood is African in its biological essence overturns centuries of prejudice and historical denial. It forces us to look at every African face in the diaspora with a new reverence, recognizing in them the bearers of an alliance that crossed oceans and survived storms of hatred. DNA is the ultimate parchment, written by a divine hand, proving that identity cannot be stolen, only temporarily hidden by veils of ignorance. By uniting biology with faith, we realize that we are living in the exact moment when the mirror finally reflects the true and powerful image of who we are. But this rediscovery is not confined to laboratories or science books. It is igniting the souls of millions of descendants around the globe. A new awakening is happening in modern cities, where the call of blood is leading the diaspora to reclaim a spiritual identity that has been denied to it for too long. In the bustling corners of New York, on the hillsides of Bahia, and in the suburbs of London, a phenomenon invisible to the inattentive eye has begun to take shape and form. It is not merely a political or social movement, but the awakening of the diaspora, where millions of descendants feel a calling that does not come from books, but from a memory that pulses in their blood. It is as if a veil is being torn, allowing those who have been called nobody for centuries to finally see the reflection of kings and prophets in their own mirrors. This symbolic return to origins doesn't require ships or planes, as it happens within the consciousness of each individual who chooses to question the stories they've been told. They are rediscovering that their spirituality didn't begin in slavery, but on a throne of wisdom that ruled the world long before chains existed. It's a journey of healing, where the shame imposed by the oppressor gives way to a sacred pride, grounded in the certainty that the faith they carry is, in fact, their birthright. Imagine the power of a generation that stops seeking validation in distant centers of power and begins to look to its own past with reverence and authority. They are reclaiming names, rights, and a connection to the divine that is vibrant, rhythmic, and profoundly African at its core. This rediscovery of spiritual identity is changing how art, music, and politics are made, as they are now nourished by a root that drinks directly from the source of the Garden of Eden. Many try to label this movement as a simple cultural curiosity, but those who are experiencing this transformation know that it is a mass spiritual resurrection. It is the fulfillment of ancient promises that said the scattered children would return to know themselves and their Creator in foreign lands. Each braid made, each ancestral word recovered, and each prayer made with the strength of the drum is a brick in the reconstruction of a temple that should never have been torn down. This awakening is living proof that Africa's hidden history doesn't belong only to the past, but is the fuel shaping the future of a new humanity. By accepting their heritage as the people who guarded the secrets of the Bible in their DNA and soul, they are ready to deliver to the world their last and most precious treasure. The legacy of sacred blood is about to be revealed in its fullness, showing that truth, however buried, always finds its way back to the sunlight. What began as a solitary walk through the red clay of the Rift Valley has transformed into a legacy that can no longer be contained by chains or historical lies. The sacred blood, which once sealed alliances under the Kushite sun, continues to flow undefeated, carrying in each drop the resilience of millennia and the dignity of those who have always been the protagonists of the divine plan. This heritage is not merely a recollection of past glories, but a living force that demands the recognition that Africa is, and always has been, the spiritual foundation of humanity. Imagine the power of a truth that survived deliberate erasure, the silence of excavations, and the distortion of languages, only to resurface now with the force of thunder. The legacy of this sacred blood invites us to look at the world with new eyes, where each ancestral symbol and each drumbeat are recognized as parts of a divine liturgy that never ceased. It is a revelation that returns the scepter to those whom the world tried to disinherit, showing that the crown of faith fits perfectly into the aesthetics and soul of the mother continent. By accepting that biblical history pulsates in African soil, we break down the last barriers that separated humanity from its true origins and its connection to the divine. This wisdom does not seek to exclude, but rather to restore balance, bringing to the center stage the missing piece needed to understand who we truly are. The legacy is an invitation to reverence, a profound respect for a land that, with its very essence, preserved the mysteries that the rest of the world is still trying to decipher. This journey back home, guided by the light of bronze and the texture of wool, transforms our understanding of the future, for now we know that tomorrow will be built upon a rock of unshakable identity. The knowledge that has been hidden for so long now acts as a compass, pointing to a time when truth will no longer be a secret of the few, but the foundation of a new global consciousness. Blood speaks, the land bears witness, and the soul recognizes that official history is but a shadow compared to the brilliance of the African sun. Many secrets still lie dormant beneath the sands and within our own genetic codes, awaiting the precise moment when humanity will have the courage to fully awaken. The story does not end here, for each archaeological discovery and each awakening of consciousness is a new step towards the complete revelation of what has been hidden. The past is not behind us. It is alive, breathing, and shaping every step of a people who have finally understood that their destiny is as eternal as the soil that gave birth to them. The shadows that for centuries have tried to conceal African greatness are dissipating, and what emerges under the sunlight is a truth that can no longer be contained. Today we walk through buried temples, decipher sacred names in ancestral languages, and look into the mirror recognizing the bronze and wool that prophecies have always described. The biblical story is not a tale of distant lands and strange peoples. It is the record of a legacy that pulsates in every drumbeat and in every cell of those who bear the mark of origin. This journey we have taken together does not end here, for the dust of time still holds many mysteries awaiting the right moment to be revealed. Africa remains the living sanctuary of humanity, the vault where the Creator deposited the keys to our deepest and most spiritual identity. May this revelation not be merely knowledge, but a seed of reverence and pride, connecting your spirit to the indomitable strength of the ancestors who guarded the faith with their own blood. Thank you for walking with me between mystery and light in this quest for hidden truth. If this secret has touched your soul, don't keep this flame to yourself. Subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and share this story with those who still walk in the darkness of forgetfulness. The seal has been broken, and new revelations about the lost civilizations and forgotten gods of Africa are already on their way. Until our next encounter with the sacred.